Welcome to our second episode of Real with Ross. I am Drew Ross, and I have today with me Reverend Dr. Willie Francois. He is the senior pastor elect of Fountain Baptist Church of Summit, New Jersey, and he has been a friend of mine for over 2 decades. I'm looking forward today to sharing with him as we have a deep dive conversation about life, ministry, and his work in social advocacy and justice. Thank you so much for being on with me today. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Dr. Drew, always a gift to be in your presence, man, and excited to be guest number two.
Man, you're the real MVP.
Man,
So before we get going, you've just transitioned into a new church climate. So
sure.
you want to talk about that and just, share your feelings so far?
Sure. So as you said, I'm at the Fountain Baptist Church in Summit, New Jersey, and it is a seismically different type of experience. And one of those being that it is a legitimate suburb in New Jersey, and it has so far been an experiment with what it means to do ministry in spaces that don't have many of the exhausting and exacting problems that we find in our major cities, whether you're talking about Baltimore
Sure.
or Newark, while also only doing full-time ministry in those spaces, or bringing that kind of experience of doing full-time ministry where I always felt like I was a first responder to social crises that weren't external from the communities that I pastored and engaged. And so that's a big difference of being in a suburb, a really white, wealthy city, right? Most of our family members of Fountain are not in Summit. We draw from across the region, from Essex County, Hudson County, and I know this is a national audience, but it draws from various counties. But it is in a pretty conservative, wealthy, white city, which I think speaks to the legacy of my predecessor, Pastor Sanders, as we are experimenting with intentional succession. It speaks to his gifts, to his vision on how he was able to build a pretty substantial, impacting ministry while in Summit, and being able to draw black folk, middle class black folk particularly, from various parts of our state. And that's different from being in Atlantic County, a part of New Jersey that is politically conservative, economically divested from, and a space that is probably the most racist place I've ever lived in my life. And I lived in Texas and Boston, which are two very conservative, racist places. Boston less conservative, but definitely racist. But to not be in that fishbowl of racism and institutionalized poverty has an impact on ministry. So I'm still exploring what that means, feeling my way through how a church in a suburbs responds to the crises that are real in these other parts of the country and the state. And another thing that I think is interesting, what I just said, is we are intentionally engaged in a transitional process. And I think that our transition could be, like, if we continue on this path, it could be a model for how I think about what my retirement strategy plans will be, and possibly how other folks should think about what it means to journey alongside a new pastor, to be a part of the congregational immersion of a new pastor after 40 years of consistent and stellar leadership. So I am in a very experimental phase of ministry after 20 plus years of doing preaching ministry, and now in my ninth year of pastoral ministry, I'm in an experimental phase, which I think is good for my own creative muscles. It's been healthy for how I breathe life into my imagination, which are very significant parts of what it means to do ministry in an age where you have at least two generations of black people, black Americans, who don't have the kind of fidelity, faithfulness to black church institutions the way other generations have, particularly like my grandmother's generation and to some extent my mom's generation.
Yeah. So before we get into the meat of our dialogue today, I think you brought up a very interesting point in your journey that many may not have heard, and I've had the privilege of kind of
Sure.
walking through these last, 6 to 8 months, really, what, about 9 months or so with you,
Sure.
from initial conversation to transition and then even into installation. Tell us how you all began this succession journey, because it seemed like it was a surprise to you that you were even being considered.
Sure. So I prior to June of 2023, I wouldn't say that I had a particularly intimate or close relationship with our pastor emeritus, Pastor J. Michael Sanders, who has served as the president of La Carey, who is now the vice president of the board of La Carey, and the president of the state convention of New Jersey. So this is a pastor that has levels of high name ID,
Yeah, big name.
across the country, but particularly in the state of New Jersey, across the country, across the world, but particularly in the state of New Jersey. And so I knew Pastor Sanders as the president of the state convention. And so he sends me a text message that he wants to meet with me. My initial response is, Mr. President, what should I bring to the meeting? Mm-hmm. And he says, just bring yourself. I am in no way expecting this conversation to have anything to do with my vocational future. I'm a social justice guy. That's what people know me as, and I'm assuming that he wants me to engage the state convention on issues of social justice. I get to the office, and he tells me that he feels that God has led him to me to be his successor after 40 years of pastoral service. And that's the extent of the process to a great degree.
Right.
So,
No real relationship.
no real relationship, no additional vetting within the congregation. Literally, he and I had conversation, prayer over the course of 3 or 4 months, closer to the 3 month side. And once I felt released from my immediate past context, and I started getting more energy, being energized around the idea of Fountain's history, Fountain's social footprint, social justice footprint, its missional identity. That was the process. The process was really one of discernment and prayer between the two of us. He then introduces me to the congregation one weekend. I do a Bible study, I preach, and 2 weeks later, he calls for a congregational vote, and unanimously, the congregation elects me to be their pastor, which I think has more to do with their trust of his leadership,
Sure,
and
yeah.
the storied nature of his integrity than it does my gifts. But obviously, I feel like God was particularly at work in that process for it to be so smooth. So while I think it has much more to do with who Pastor Sanders is, just honoring that God uses personalities. We talk about preaching being the communication of truth through personalities. Ministry is the performance of love and truth through personalities. So I know that who I am mattered to the process, but I salute the way that he has led this congregation, for 40 years, that would allow them to trust him to pick me to lead them on this journey. And these last 90 days, 90 plus days, have probably been some of the most loving times of being a part of a congregation since I was at the Wheeler Avenue Church, honestly.
Now that's pretty incredible. And then also let's back up for a second to think about what it must have been like for you to put that kind of trust in Pastor Sanders' intentions, because most of the time we see nowadays that pastors will start talking about retirement, want to bring someone in as the successor,
Sure,
and then they fall through
sure,
on the desire to retire.
sure.
And they hold that person in limbo for 5, 7, 10 years
Oh, I've seen it.
in this pastoral or assistant pastoral, which they think is going to quickly transition them. And it's almost like they breathe new life into that person that was supposed to be retiring because they have a new kid
Sure.
on the block in their mind that the congregation is starting to attach themselves to. What kind of difference did you feel from Pastor Sanders about his intentions, his integrity, and his intentionality about the process?
One is he had a very clear timeline. And he was moving according to that timeline, even as we were in discernment with each other in terms of how he was talking to the congregation. One of the things that's important is a year before he introduced me to the congregation, he started a sermon series that lasted for a year entitled Joshua is Coming. And so he spent a year preaching to the congregation about how to ready itself for his successor, what types of values, ministry priorities he was looking for in, or he was expecting God to manifest in a successor. So to spend that much preaching real estate on the succession process, that was encouraging. In addition to following that timeline, the third thing that gave me some level of comfort, and I did enter this with skepticism, I want to be clear about that, was the fact that when we started talking about the HR side of this, but literally every request I had was met.
Wow.
And I can't think of anything that we had to negotiate.
No, that's awesome, because that doesn't normally happen like that.
It doesn't happen. And I just, in full disclosure, I was, well, partial disclosure, I was a part of a conversation of pastoral succession and discernment with another pastor, very, very celebrated pastor. And for a year, he and I were in conversation, and I probably trusted him a little too much, and then he decided he didn't want to retire. So I entered into this conversation with Pastor Sanders with some levels of skepticism, not because of him, but because of my own experience with a similarly situated dynamic. And so that did exist. But the fourth thing that I think helped was that we would do a year together, and he was already very clear about what his exit day would be. And the idea of us doing a year, and to do a year together, not where I'm a staff pastor and he's the senior pastor, but doing a year together where he was very clear that he would be the staff pastor and I would be the senior pastor, was also a very unique iteration of how this could work. And so he was very clear. I am becoming pastor emeritus. I want to be treated like an associate pastor. When pastor wants me to preach, I will preach. The idea of empowering me around the budget, empowering me around staff hires. That was another very significant part of this, is that he allowed me to bring 2 hires with me. So day one, I come in with my executive assistant and a digital communications director who both came with me from Mount Zion. Like those types of commitments early on and giving me hiring power and to some extent firing power early on were also signs that, oh no, he's serious about this.
Yeah. And even having the humility to take that role with you where he intentionally sets you up to be in that spot of leadership and he takes more of the staff pastor role helps the people to see that he's putting his confidence there because you can trust to be led by him because I can trust him to lead me.
Yeah.
And I think that those kind of moments are what helps people to see that it's real.
Sure. Sure.
So when you got the call, when you started going through the movements forward with him, and you realized that it felt similar to what you had experienced before, what helped you not to go in the shell of, I don't want this experience again?
I was probably much more prayerful this round than I was in that first iteration. I think there were so many attractive dimensions of that first iteration that I just assumed it was God without actually adding my own levels of spiritual discipline and practice to it. I entered into this intentional about what I needed to feel interiorly and how I needed to be clear about certain how I needed to be clear that this pastor was also committed to a prayerful process, and I don't know if that was the case the first time around. And so honestly, I think I was at a different space in terms of my own spirituality and the spirituality of the pastor, right? And that's the difference between being 4 years into a senior pastor role and being 8 years into a senior pastor role. I have cultivated new levels of spiritual discipline that are associated with the pastorate that I didn't have before. And so what I'm saying is my antenna was peaked, and it caused me to pay more attention to my own spiritual needs, the spiritual future of my family, and doing that with prayer, bathing that in prayer was helpful for me not to retreat, because there are many times that he has thanked me. Pastor Sanders has thanked me that I didn't become reclusive. I didn't withdraw within the process based on previous experiences, but literally it's only because I think I centered this as a spirituality priority and not just a employment shift or a vocational shift.
Yeah. And you come into this very differently than you did coming into the pastorate at Mount Zion.
True.
Because you went into Mount Zion as a single pastor.
True.
No relationship that was on the forefront.
Sure. Sure.
No child.
True.
So how do you approach now that idea with Fountain? I mean, you go into Fountain very differently than you went into Mount Zion. How do you think that has been a factor in your development?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because fatherhood has surely disciplined me, but marriage has also caused me to, in a lot of ways, divest from some of my selfishness that is easy to function with, which is a type of maturation process within itself. I make decisions now thinking about this unit and not just about my own trajectory. And, I have had probably, most people will probably think about my journey and think it's been a pretty charmed ministerial pastoral journey. And to some degree it has been. But I've been able to make pastoral decisions, vocational decisions, just thinking about me, what I want, my dreams, my ambitions. I got to be self-interested in ways that I have to be more family-driven now. And I think that's important. The other piece is Pastor Sanders has been an unmarried pastor for 40 years, and there is high elation about the presence of Delijah and Willie the Fourth, and soon to be the new addition to our life. There is high elation and ecstasy about having someone to accompany the pastor, to some people doing life with the pastor. And Fountain has been really, like, gratuitously invested in the happiness and the joy of Four and Elijah, which has been really heart expanding to experience, and it only helps me ingratiate myself to them even more
Yeah.
because they are willing and interested and excited about caring for my family.
Yeah. Now I'll say this, and if we go too far with this, I'll cut it out. I don't mind.
Okay.
But it's also interesting to see Fountain's ability to be mature about some of the things that other search processes weren't mature about with regard to, your marriage and some of the things like that have been out in circles about you with regard to, your wife's company
Sure.
and things like that, and how people have skewed
Sure.
the argument to be so secular and worldly,
Sure.
about those things. And even the fact that, in having a baby prior to being married, like
Sure.
those things never caused for them some of the issues that in other search processes it has caused. And I think that also goes back to their level of maturity by which they've been pastored to see beyond human abilities to, make decisions that may not be in a moment what someone might think is best,
Sure.
and be able to go beyond that in order to really see the gift, the call
Sure.
on a person's life to pastor them amidst what may be what some would suggest, hard things to get past.
Sure, and I think that this is true because of the type of community that has been cultivated there. It's a progressive church. I'm not saying it's the most liberal church in the country, but it's a very progressive church. It is also a church that has been formed to not have a considerable investment in the pastor's private life. It sounds as if that was a non-negotiable. That was a red line when it came to my predecessor. Is that it's not something that they engaged. So to some extent, I think it's the kind of boundaries that they're used to maintaining with their senior pastor that have been, I think, stellarly upheld by Pastor Sanders, and then the kind of theological progressivism that exists, that they carry out, that they lean into as a congregation, I think is important. And I'm not just talking about a congregation that's committed to social justice. I'm talking about a congregation that has been intentional in a lot of ways about creating space for difference.
Yeah, which is something that you need because you are such a proponent for people
Sure.
to be able to live
Sure.
the different aspects of their life
Sure.
without being judged or condemned.
One of our good friends, Melik Thomas, who now pastors in your hometown, he texted me the other day and was like, "Man, I think you have found home." And he's like, theologically, I think you have found home. Socially, I think you have found home. And I think that's true. It is the kind of space that I need, considering the ways that I show up in the pastorate, the ways I think church. My ecclesiology is, it's about liberation.
Yeah.
And I didn't intend for my life to be one of those invitations for a church to figure out whether or not they were really committed to justice, committed to liberation. But to some extent, the idea that my wife is she's a pole studio owner in addition to being a pole dancer. And obviously not a stripper. Obviously not a stripper. And you still have to make that distinction in this climate. But the idea that, my wife does not have the traditional first lady occupation.
And they know this.
And they know this, right? In fact, well, yes, they know this. And the fact that I had a child with my wife prior to us being married, it wasn't my intention, but it does set an invitation. Like, if you can embrace this with your pastor, then anybody who walks through those doors with similar life narratives that we tend to demonize in church, it's an inherently welcoming space to that extent.
It makes them live up to the love ethic.
It makes them live up to the love ethic of Jesus. Now, and our church is very clear on what Elijah's profession is. I mean, she owns a studio in Brooklyn, and many of our members have expressed interest in going to the studio and taking classes. She was the feature in what's called Ladies' Night at our church. I think we had about 250 ladies who came out, and she was the featured speaker. And she was just very clear about what she does, why she does it, how she understands it to be a ministry of women's empowerment. That was probably helpful as well for them to hear it from her versus just reading it in the New York Times. But to hear it from her, I mean, I think it has only elevated the sense of respect and endearment that they have for her. And again, I mean, dozens of sisters have been like, can we do it here at the church? Can this be a part of our fitness engagement? Because she does it as
Sure,
a practice of
yeah,
fitness,
absolutely, and very successful with it.
And very successful. I mean, social media wise, she's very successful in terms of the brick and mortar studio that she has now has been wildly successful. And
conferences.
She does conferences and retreats all over the world.
So you talked about the New York Times, which I would say, really made sure that the headline was attractive when they covered
Clickbait.
Covered your wedding, and I was there, so
you were there.
I know what the event was like. It definitely wasn't.
It was good fun too.
It was, but it definitely wasn't as secular as they made it seem. But they titled the article.
I know we served communion.
It was very spiritual.
No, we partied too, though.
We
Let's
did.
be clear. We did party on the huts.
But it wasn't that way as it seemed when you clicked the article.
Sure.
It was a very beautiful event. But they titled the article, "When a Pastor and a Pole Dancer Fall in Love." And you're quoted as saying you see yourself as one of those who are intentional about making the church live up to the love ethic we say we care about.
Sure.
So how do you think that the church is doing living up to those love ethics? And can you explain what you meant behind the statement?
Sure. What's interesting about the article is the print version of the article was titled "A Union That Has the Church Talking" or something like that.
Okay.
So it's not as much clickbait, but
No.
I'm assuming the wedding section of the print version is a go-to anyway, so you don't need the kind of click bait. But so when I think about this love ethic, right, and I do consider myself a type of love disruptor. And that's what I mean by being a gadfly. I think that's at the heart of what it means to be a prophet. And, people who call themselves prophets are generally not really prophets. But I try to lean into the prophetic, or what one writer called the prophethood of all believers. This idea that we are all supposed to be engaged in the work of ensuring that justice is in the DNA of what our faith communities do. So when I think about the love ethic of Jesus, I mean, it's why I'm committed to justice. It's why I'm committed to liberation. This love ethic of Jesus is what drives me to thinking about the political in terms of how do we help people who are trapped underneath systems and structures of domination build power, right? And I see that as love. Doing social justice is a type of love. The work of helping folk who are on the underside of power build power is a type of love. It's in one place, this new book that I have coming out tentatively entitled Outing Blue Privilege. I spend some time thinking about how we shift from thinking about public safety to public love. Right? And public love as this manifestation of radical egalitarian justice. For me, that comes from my sense of Jesus summing up the laws in 3 prongs: love of neighbor, love of God, love of self. Love of God obviously goes first. It's this triangular love that Jesus invites us into. It's this triadic love that Jesus says that we're supposed to be engaged in. Love of God, love of neighbor, love of self, that I consider this love ethic of Jesus. And when I'm talking about love, I'm not talking about sentimentality. I'm not talking about this anemic form of love that's connected to our emotions and our preferences. But when I think about love, it is a state of grace. It is a way of being in the world where we are forced to see all of our destinies caught up in each other's destiny. It is this idea that our humanity is caught up in one another. And so I make decisions for the other, with the other, understanding that those decisions have an impact on our mutual lives, on our mutual journey. That's how I think about love. Love is our capacity to see our lives as interlocked together, and our futures and our destinies are being tied to one another. It's a duty that we owe one another. That's how I think about love. How is the church doing on this?
And that's scored appropriately.
I think that there are outliers in this, because I mean, when I think about American Christianities, and primarily when I think about white evangelicalism and how that is often presented and modeled in blackface and black voice, when I think about white Christian nationalism, which is now driving American politics, which is why I say public love, right? Because we need a political form of love that becomes the antidote to this predatory, toxic, white supremacy embodying religion that is American. So it's hard for me to answer how the church is doing, because some of the loudest purveyors of so-called Christianities happen to be people who are not invested in what it means to do life together, not invested in what it means to practice that love ethic of Jesus. When you have churches that are still saying women can't preach, and churches that are taking stances on marriage that are intentionally designed to create hatred for other people, which I think is different than how I'm talking about people who are overtly homophobic. It's hard to say that the church is doing well on it when I think about how little we're engaged in the work of bettering, ameliorating the condition of the poor. It's hard to say that the church is doing well when it comes to this love ethic of Jesus. And it would be easy for us to just say that it's the white church, particularly the evangelical white church, that is missing this. But there's so many of our black churches that are not invested in justice, not invested in creating radical welcome for people who are living hell on a daily basis. And we got to be clear about that. Martin King says, any religion that claims to be concerned about the souls of men, but not the economic conditions that strangle those souls, that's dry as dust religion. I've been very clear that any theology that cannot speak to the events that happen at Wounded Knee, the slave living in the hull of a ship across the Atlantic, cannot speak to a child in an oven in Auschwitz, cannot respond to hospitals being bombed in the Gaza Strip that's killed 31,000 people, it's hard to call that Christian. Yeah. It's hard to call that a ministry that is that grows out of the love ethic of that Palestinian carpenter who died not because he preached about love, but who died because love got him in trouble.
Yeah. So I think that now you're bringing in a tension between traditional and progressive forms of church, how they see love, how they operate within their structures to make sure that they promote a Jesus that is not according to the system that we may have once seen him. Sure. And you are very much a product of a traditional church climate in the South.
No question.
You come from a very traditional Baptist background in the South. So You beginning your ministry young in the South, coming from a traditional church setting, what do you think that traditionalism looks like in the church? What's the importance of it, and how do you see yourself as one who's been reared in it but doesn't subscribe to it?
Sure. I am a son of the church, a son of the church in the South. And the church has paid every bill that I've had for the most part for my adult life. I have a deep love for the Church of Jesus. I also believe that churches deserve to have traditions. But I draw the distinction, and I really get this nuance from Serene Jones at Union Theological Seminary. There's a difference between tradition and traditionalism. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living.
Wow.
There's some things we do just because we've done them before, but they don't provide life. They don't animate anything new in the public square, in the personal lives of people. And I think that the Church of Jesus, particularly here in America, which is one of the richest religious markets in the world. I mean, when you think about industrialized nations, we're the only one that's still doing religion at the high level that we do. We have to figure out whether or not we want to be committed to tradition, which we have a right to be, or whether we want to be straitjacketed by traditionalism. And some of that means that how I talk about this is we have to figure out how to, I'm grateful for the Jesus that saves us, but it's probably time for us to save Jesus from the American way of life. That we have made Jesus American, we've made Jesus a militarist, we've made Jesus capitalist, we've made Jesus white. We have to get back to that Jesus of Palestine, and I use that P word intentionally. We have to get back to the Jesus who was that carpenter in Galilee, and figure out whether or not our traditions, which is probably more traditionalism, actually lives alongside what he taught. One of my greatest concerns about the Western church is I don't know that we take Jesus seriously. I don't know how often we are reading Jesus and following Jesus' words. For some reason, we've convinced ourselves that if we confess with our mouths and believe with our hearts, that's where it stops. We've convinced ourselves that if we know Jesus' biography, where he was born, to whom he was born, the few people he healed, where he died, how he overcame death, that makes us disciples. But to be a disciple means that I am learning from, I'm immersing myself in the teachings of. How often you and I grew up in a time where red letter Bibles were real.
Absolutely.
How many of us are really taking the letters in red seriously? One thing I've asked every church I've worked at, from the Wheeler Avenue Church to the Fountain Church, I've asked, how many parables can we quote? How many of us know the Sermon on the Mountain? Do we know the difference between the Sermon on the Mountain and the Sermon on the Plain? Do we actually take seriously the teachings of Jesus? Because to limit Jesus' life and impact to what we just celebrated on Easter weekend may be enough for some people, but there's a reason why he spent 3 years teaching. I don't know that we should only take his last 3 days over against or put them in opposition to those 3 years of teaching about love, about the kingdom, about faith, about life, about liberation. And yeah, I think we have to figure out as church persons, as leaders of the church, how much of our tradition is really traditionalism, and how does that stand in relief to what Jesus actually told us to be about and do in the world.
So, where do you think the church can improve on its progressive mindset?
Well, like I said, I think one area is how we understand and how we engage Jesus. I think Jesus was a progressive, and most of it is because of his actions, but other places where Jesus is bringing his religious tradition, his scriptures to life. You know, someone did a study that says, only 15% of what Jesus was preaching had direct reference to the Old Testament. That Jesus is forecasting God using the same words, same values, same foundations to point humanity in a different direction. That's very progressive, right? And I use that word intentionally over liberal, but I think that's very progressive. So one is, how do we reimagine? And reimagine is not the right word. How do we begin to take Jesus seriously? I think it's going to be important for us. Of course, there are a range of social issues that I think that the church has to atone for. And one of the most significant sins that I think the church needs to atone for is how it has treated women, particularly the black church. Black churches, and I don't use black church often. I'm using it as a shorthand now, but I think that black churches have to atone for the sins that it has committed against black women. There is no black institution, no church, without the presence, gifts, resources, sacrifices of black women. But there's still so many of ours. The National Baptist Convention, USA, is still the largest black religious body in this country, and it's still on record, whether the individual churches differ or not. On record, the institution itself is against gender equity. National Baptist Convention of America, not as large, but still large, against women gender equity. National Missionary Baptist Convention. Like 3 of the 4 historic black conventions are not in favor of black women preaching. The Church of God in Christ. The majority of the black church, to be clear, does not support women in ministry.
Yeah.
And we have to figure out what that means for black women's futures, and what that means for the legacy of black churches. I think that's a very clear area where we have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, where are we getting this from? And some people call that progressive. I don't call that progressive. I call that just being realistic. I mean, we just celebrated a holiday where the first person to announce an empty tomb was a woman. And might I add, a black woman, right? Considering her own Hebrew Palestinian identity. A black woman did that. Like, what does it mean that we cannot, in 2024, affirm the leadership, the giftedness, the sacrifices of black women? I think that's a sin of the church that we have to work on. I think the church has to make space for being welcoming and affirming of our queer brothers and sisters. And now I have my own theological commitments to an understanding of why I embrace and create space for our queer brothers and sisters. But I think that whether or not people go as far as I go, we still have to ask ourselves, how can we lock people out of ministry, and how can we lock people out of community when the very person that we follow did the opposite of that? Like, I don't argue with people about whether or not they think something is a sin or not. I know how I understand sin. Anything that contradicts that tripartite love of God, love of neighbor, love of self. That's how I understand sin. I don't try to micromanage how other communities understand sin. So I'm not pushing people to say whether or not they should think, queer people are sinners or not, or queer life is sinful or not. That's not my point here. My point is that as Jesus people, how can we not be welcoming of the stranger?
Yeah.
As Jesus people, how can we not honor the gifts of people who have been systematically disinherited? As Jesus people, how can we ever be party to the exclusion of folk when we know exactly what it feels like to be excluded from political systems, from churches? The reason why the black church exists is because we were not allowed to live with any type of agency or authority in white churches. And to be clear, it was because they thought black people were inherently sinful. Let's not forget that there was a reading of the Bible that was just in effect about 150 years ago that said black people were sinful because they were black. Like, how can we be okay doing that to another group of people, particularly those that look like us, that we've raised, that we've cared for? For me, this is not about, and again, I'm not queer, so I maybe, maybe folk like Brandon Crowley, one of my dearest friends who who write books on queering the black church, are concerned about what people see as sin and not as sin. I know my own theological convictions around it, but this is about how do we create welcoming space that honors what Jesus says we should be engaged in. And I don't know how we do that if we are flagrantly exclusive of our queer sibling.
And so, how do you balance the conflicting views of religion with real world situations like that? I mean, you advocate for black people, you advocate for LGBTQ, underserved and under privileged communities. How do you balance those conflicting ideas, especially pastoring in a pulpit where oftentimes the church is not on that page,
Yeah.
and especially the black church?
One of the things that I learned pretty early on is one of the roles of the pastor is to lead theologically. It's not my prerogative to be a theological follower. I think that as an interpreter of the gospel, I'm paid to interpret the Bible. That's what people pay me to do, alongside a lot of other things, right? Preaching is the least that we do in this job, and I know everybody who's listening knows that. But a big thing of what they expect from us is to lead them theologically. And I take that seriously. So I think I have space to use this very expensive education that my mama sent me to get from Morehouse, and then I went on to get the master's and the doctorate, is to actually use it, right? And to use it in a way to dig into this very ancient text that we all love, that I preach from, that I think is authoritative, and find the most amount of truth as possible. But all any of us ever have is an interpretation.
Sure,
And
yeah,
all I can give
absolutely.
people is my interpretation. And I hold that interpretation with tentative confidence. Now, people get upset with me when I say that. I was at a conference a few years ago, and I said, I lead, and it's a pretty big conference too, where they sort of have these conversations between conservatives and progressives. They didn't call me the progressive on the panel, but I realized I was the progressive on the panel. I hold my truths with tentative confidence. I believe that I am always evolving, and I trust that I have space to evolve the same way I'm expecting other, and by that I mean grow. I want to continue to grow theologically, but my growth theologically has communal implications because I am engaging people in this work. So I understand the work I do to be that of leading theologically, and there's some risk I'm willing to take based on my understanding of Jesus, based on my capacity to interpret scripture with the resources that I have developed over the years that we went to school to do this work. And I think it's criminal for me to just settle into what has been said and what has been interpreted when I've been given new resources to be an interpreter myself. I don't know why, for me, I don't know why Augustine gets to be a greater interpreter of scripture than I am. I don't know why Bonhoeffer gets to be a greater authority of scripture than you are, right? We are theological leaders, and we probably come to different conclusions, but I don't know that we have a right to just follow where the trends have been, to follow where the religion has been, when in 2024 we've been exposed to resources that Bonhoeffer would never be exposed to, that Augustine would never understand, that Tillich didn't have any, that Barth had no capacity for knowing.
Absolutely.
Like,
Yeah.
my childhood pastor, Reverend James A. Wren, he's in sainted memory now. He didn't have the luxury of the type of theological education I had. And I think that I owe it to him, whether or not he would agree with me or not, I owe it to him to use that theology, to use that education that he always wanted but didn't have access to because of circumstance of birth and circumstance of time.
And access.
And access. Couldn't afford it.
Right. Yeah. So you pastor, though, in a very different time, technology wise, than all others aforementioned did. And kind of coming up on the conclusion of our time, how do you balance all of your beliefs and how you communicate them against an age of social media where people will take, let's say, even a piece of this podcast and take a soundbite from it and categorize you a particular way without listening to the totality of the statement, especially in context and over the entirety of a conversation, the dangers of that. And then second, how does this generation we live in connect with a younger demographic amidst the age of social media and the online church community with the everyday temptations of the world? I mean, you're talking about living out conviction very boldly and widely in an age where you can be pushed against that, one, because of soundbite, and then two, because the social media age and everything that the young people are dealing with. How does the church navigate that?
Well, one of the things I want to say is this hyper socially mediated time that we live in has robbed us of the respect of privacy. I feel like privacy is a byword now. It's gone, and that's something we have to adjust to. And I'm not saying people get to know everything about our lives, but there's this expectation that everything we say is vulnerable to scrutiny. And so I'm very clear that there's some things I've said in this session that can be sliced and sound, bitten and reproduced in ways that don't reflect the conversation that you and I have had here today. And that's a nature of the current beast that we live in. What it causes us to do is to be more conscious of the economy of language and words that we have. We're rhetorical professionals. Like we live based on our words. And I think that if nothing else, it gives us a challenge to be more precise. It gives us a challenge to not speak something that we don't have convictions around. I think it draws us out it gives us the opportunity to be more authentic as religious leaders when it comes to what we really believe. One of the things that I have always been suspicious of is if our colleagues actually go to seminary to learn, or do they just go to seminary for the credential, right? Because it's possible to go to seminary but not allow seminary to go through you. I think some of the things that we get to do as thinkers, and you and I have these kind of conversations regularly, and I don't know how widespread these conversations are actually happening, but I think that it gives us an opportunity for us to always be in the process of refining how we communicate in public, what theologically we are committed to, and taking that risk. Anytime you get before a microphone, you're taking a risk, but we can't not take the risk because we still do carry the words of eternal life that we've inherited from that carpenter, and how we interpret them, how we communicate them, how we live by them. I think we need to just lean into it even more. Yeah. That these are our convictions, and we'll take the consequences that come along with these convictions. I also want to say that this moment gives us greater opportunity to have the kind of expansive ministry that previous generations would have only dreamt of. That there are people who benefit from what you do at New Hope who will never come to New Jersey, who may never step into your space. And that gives us a challenge to think about the congregation in front of us and the congregation we can't see. All of us now are pastoring invisible congregations. There are people in this world who consider us their pastors that we've never met. They've never given a dollar to our church.
Absolutely.
Right?
And they will never join.
And they will never join. But they consider us their pastors. And so that's another challenge that I think this moment gives us. How do we also pastor the invisible folk? And I'm using invisible in a very,
You don't know them.
social media way. We don't know them.
Yeah.
We don't know who they are. We don't know who they want. But there's something about what we offer that's important. So I guess I'm trying to say, in this moment that is very confusing and very disappointing in times, I'm trying to refine myself to be the most authentic I can be, to be the most precise I can be, to be the most intentional I can be, because I'm very clear that there are audiences, and I'm using that, just for colloquial sake, but there are audiences, there are pockets of community who can benefit from my convictions.
Sure.
And benefit from the way I lead, and benefit from the theologies that I am committed to. And many of them are younger generations. And social media gives us that opportunity to test that out in way. And I really want to call it a test, right? I've been using experiment a lot today, but I think that's how we have to start thinking about what we do. Like, we have convictions, but we're experimenting with methods and experimenting with layers of engagement, a range of things. And as disappointing as this moment is, it's also an exciting moment, because we get to do the kinds of public work that, if we take it seriously, the kind of public work that our souls must have, to use the words of Katie Cannon. So I don't know if I answered the fullness
I think it's good.
of your question, but that's how I'm seeing this moment. It's a challenge, and this challenge is offering us opportunities to engage differently. What I know for sure, bro, is when I think about, for the first time in American history, or since we've been tracking it, that black children are having suicide ideation at a higher rate than white children. When I think about the fact that the pandemic stole years from children, when I think about how learning loss and learning trauma is proliferating right now, I raise a very different question about what it means to capture this next generation. And I don't know that what I'm doing and how I'm engaging is an assault or an affront to the Word of God. I don't see it in that way. But what I know is that we have to build a new spiritual infrastructure, or we are going to not just lose generations for the church, like, we're going to lose generations on this earth. There's a deep sense of hopelessness that exists right now. Highest levels of loneliness that we've ever experienced. There were times where people only experienced loneliness when they were aged, when they were old. But you have children right now who are lonely, who've been around students all day, who are on social media. We need a different type of spiritual infrastructure, because life is actually on the line. And so however we can employ social media, however we can employ media like this, to build out that new infrastructure of spirituality, I think we have to be intentional about it, because this is a matter of life and death, and it's becoming more grave, I think, as generations pass through life. I'm seriously concerned about what the spiritual health of my son's generation will be. And not because I care if they go to church. I have a personal investment in it, because I need people to go to church. My livelihood is connected to that. But when I'm talking about the spiritual infrastructure, I'm concerned about where we actually learn what it means to be human. I often say that Jesus didn't come to teach us how to be spiritual. Jesus came to teach us what it means to be human. And I don't know where we are learning how to be human right now if not for our churches? Like, how do we practice? How do we learn what it means to love? How do we learn what it means to sacrifice and care for one another? Where are the spaces where we learn how to show up for people? Where are those spaces? That's the kind of spiritual infrastructure that I'm concerned we're going to lose, that we might lose all of those little graces of what it means to be alive and what it means to care for one another. I mean, we've heard this over and over again, how just 2 generations ago, you could leave your door open. 2 generations ago, you could go next door and you know that they would let you borrow meat, not just sugar. You could borrow meat from the freezer of your neighbor. Where's that kind of communal engagement?
You're not taking meat from
right
anybody's freezer nowadays.
No, they're not giving it.
No.
Some of it
Not only they're
afford.
not giving it to you, you don't want it. Because you don't know how they keep the house.
No, you're right. You're right. But that willingness for people to share and do life with one another, that's a part of our humanity that we're losing.
Yeah.
And I don't, for me, black church spaces are the most optimal places for us to practice those graces, learn those graces, and learn how to love.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing with us today. Everything you said, very poignant. As we close, I just want you to give us one thing. Give us a charge on how we can live out best practices, something quick that we can just take with us to remember as we go on.
I would say, and I've said this before today, but I want to say it again, is I think we have to re-examine who Jesus is by re-examining who Jesus was. We've so disconnected that historical Jesus that we read about in the scripture from this Christ on the right hand of God that we, I don't even know if they would recognize each other if we introduce the Jesus that we've created in our mind from the Jesus that we read about in scripture. What is the cardinal sin of the church? We've stopped taking Jesus seriously, and we have just decided to worship Jesus and a range of other things. But I think the one thing we can do is get back to that red letter Jesus, that Palestinian carpenter Jesus, and leave this Americanized white Christ in a grave and stop resurrecting him every week.
Thank you. All right, you heard our charge for this, our second episode. Live it out as we're challenged to be more mature and more upfront about how we see Jesus and how we push the real Jesus in the world. Thank you again.
Love you, bro.
Love you too, bro.